Hey everybody, and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program RP-0. This is our first section will be our Twitch recap from last week's live show, where we were doing finalizations on our new lander prototype that we are going to box up and ship out to Mars. First thing we need to do is take a lot of the fuel out of it because it is pretty heavy, and give it some method of capturing around Mars. Now, had I been smart, I would have made those thruster blocks shielded tanks, and maybe just a very tiny heat shield at the bottom there where the engine port is. Could have given us the possibility of an Aero capture. We are going to be bringing a spare engine for this test as a just in case. That way we don't have to ship one out with the next basket, which might be problematic. So the decision ultimately was made to go for propulsive capture, which is going to be fairly Delta V intensive, but with the experimental engine in triplicate here, I think we can keep it within our rated burn time and still manage to capture around Mars. Now our DV figures are with like a 90% drained lander thingy because tonnage, and well, we had intended on just refueling at Harmonia Station as would be normal practice, so we'll slap it on top of our standard heavy workhorse, the DN6 BX LR. I think it's the total designation here. As you see, it's got the solar panels and the radiators, intent on using some of that B upper stage for burning at its arrival destination. So we'll get bearings on it. We'll make sure that our engines are the correct type. There's all kinds of funny things that happen when loading things from a sub-assembly, and then double and triple checking our staging before we just go ahead and slap the world's most awkward fairing on top of this thing, because even with the fairing auto turned on, it just, well, it did not really want to cooperate with us. So we end up with this. Yeah. We've flown more awkward-looking fairings before, but I'm hard-pressed to think of one at the moment. So, once again, a solid triple check of our fairing, and then we'll get back to our normally scheduled Mars launches. Now, this is a liquid fuel resupply pod. This one's carrying Aerozine 50 and nitrogen tetroxide bound for Mars, because we are in the middle of probably the easiest Mars window we've had in many, many, many years. It's a pretty broad window. I think we've stretched our launches across 30 days or so, and really we're getting transferred to Mars for about 3.7 kilometers per second, which is quite fortunate for the program, because, well, it just means we can send cargo for the sake of sending it. So there's fairing SEP and booster SEP, and the stunning realization that I reconfigured this resupply pod for use around Harmonia Station and refueling the large liquid tank there, or possibly had it built in preparation for the restarting of our lunar program after getting rid of the old liquid fuel storage tank. As such, there is one very, very critical flaw with this here resupply pod. It does not have a heat shield. These were designed to aero capture around Mars because it saves us so much Delta V, and then aero brake into a lower orbit to perform rendezvous and then eventually docking with Harmonia Station. This one is lacking that heat shield because it was built to be used around the moon. This is a pretty significant problem in that it does have enough fuel to propulsively capture, but the whole point of this thing was to bring the fuel to Harmonia Station, not use it to get to Harmonia Station. So we've got an interesting conundrum where this thing will either burn up in the atmosphere trying to slowly brake, or use the vast majority of its fuel storage to avoid the atmosphere entirely. Either way, the launch is going out, and we're going to try to get it there really for no other reason than, well, what else are we going to do with it at this point? We have to try, because we don't have another one of these built, and we can't get another one built before the window closes. So this is really our only opportunity to make sure that we can refuel our prototype lander this window. And our next launch is, of course, our crewed launch. It's a Chestnut M sitting on top of a BPR rocket. So we need to choose our 6 lucky winners for, was this our 4th round trip to Mars? Yeah, this is our 4th crew going to Mars. So Diane Bowman will be our command pilot, Lee Lambert, our lead scientist. And really, we're kind of short-staffed at the moment. Everyone else that we have available to us has already gone to Mars, or should be very, very retired. So Evgenia Tamiakera, Dmitry Gorbachev, Elisa Savannah, and Laura Douglas will round out the crew for this mission. Initially, they will stay on station and observe the remote testing of the new lander prototype, provided we can fuel it. I think we have enough stores out there that we should be able to. We do also have some reserve fuel we can pull from Chestnut itself to see if we can't get that at least initial test, uncrewed test landing in the books, because we're going to have to send them out a replacement basket and more fuel, which will require next Mars window. So they're just going to be out there cleaning up some of the research from the lab. Maybe we'll, since we have a spare engine for the lander, maybe we'll take a quick tour of Deimos and Phobos, because we'll have some runtime that we can burn off. No big deal. So BPR cleared the pad a good long while ago and is now leaning into its gravity turn rather successfully. This thing is a frame rate destroyer. I'm surprised we're yellow clock instead of red clock, to be real honest with you, but speeding this footage up 4 times kind of brings it into the real-time playback realm. This is sped up a little bit more than that so that we can get all of our launches from this window included in this episode. So first booster SEP was just a little while ago. They are clear and away. We are coming up on second stage booster SEP. There they go. That was the 3 engine boosters. Now we just have the 2 engine boosters and the core stage left on our Keralox, basically pad lit assembly, and we're starting to pick up real speed now. These booster SEPs and their engine count were kind of configured to maintain a TWR of less than 2-ish for most of the ascent profile, and also give us enough leeway in the ascent curve. There's our explosive tower SEP, fairing plate SEP, and booster SEP all within just a couple of seconds of each other. That sheds a lot of tonnage. I think the escape tower assembly itself is something like 25 tons, which is mind-boggling, but when you consider how heavy the Chestnut capsule actually is, it's absolutely necessary. Were there to be some kind of failure in the launch vehicle, it actually would pull the crew to safety. We did test for that. Actually, honestly, we did test for that. So we're leaning back on the stick just a little bit now to give ourselves a little headway in that time to apogee before we light our RS-25 Hydrolox upper stage. There's fairing SEP and ignition of those 5 RS-25s. They're going to push us much further out of the atmosphere and get us almost all the way to orbit. We should be within, 50 to 100 meters per second of delta V on this RS-25 stage, so that the Echo upper stage can just do a very light push to help round out our orbit. So we'll go ahead and get our comms things booted, get our external radiators on the Echo upper stage fired up and operational, help keep some of that liquid hydrogen liquid so that we can carry as much of it with us all the way to Mars as possible. The Echo upper stage is responsible for not only our ejection burn, but the first little bit of our capture burn once we get to Mars. The rest of it, of course, will be handled by Chestnut itself with a very powerful Keralox. Was it NK-15? I think it's the Block 5 of the N1 is our main rocket. Alright, RS-25s are depleted. Successful ignition of all 3 HG3s on the Echo upper stage, and there is orbit. We still have 4.5 kilometers per second left in our Echo upper stage, And that was unfortunately where I had to end the stream, but I did get a chance to today come back to this vehicle and finish out our trans-Mars injection burn. So we've got the node all set up here. Thank you, Mech Jeb. And 3/4 of an orbit or so, 1 hour in orbit, and we'll just go ahead and loop ourselves around. This thing is extraordinarily heavy and could really use a thruster upgrade. I just don't know why I actually put those twin port quad assemblies on it instead of the 3-port ones that are just so much more powerful. It's something to consider, 'cause it does look like we're going to be returning to this vehicle quite a few more times before the series is completed, which there's no real plan for that, so don't read into that statement more than there actually is. But solid light on all 3 HG3s again for their second ignition. Now we did have a contract to radio science in from low Earth orbit because, well, we need the money. That was the other thing that we're going to discuss, is that I spent a lot of money rush building our Mars lander prototype, to the extent that we were down to like 300,000 some odd funds. Oops. Sold back 1 or 2 rockets from our stable also. Missions that won't fly anytime soon, or that some redundancy backup missions that didn't fly at their proposed time. So, yeah, I think we probably spent upwards of $750,000 trying to rush that Mars lander out onto the pad in time to make it for this window, which probably not the smartest thing, but I think after our Titan mission wraps up and we can get back to business as usual, we'll start cycling crew to and from Kauai Potato Station on those 3 Kerbal to low Earth orbit and space station crew rotation contracts to prop up the space program as much as we can to prevent ourselves from going broke. We do have 1 or 2 contracts in the works that were we to fail, we would basically be bankrupt, and we're in a place right now where we don't really have that many rockets we can sell back. We might be able to buy ourselves 1 or 2 Shuriken flights, but it might not be good enough. Anyway, so we are coming up on our completion of this burn, and there is our actual encounter at Mars. I just had to make sure we did not have an engine failure. I thought I heard a pitch change. Wasn't actually a thing, but we'll go ahead and set up another node to kind of dial in our approach here. Set our target as Harmonia Station, and it looks like we can come in with less than 3 degrees of inclination between us and our target, which is absolutely fantastic. We're going to save so much fuel on the inclination change to match our orbits with Harmonia. That's probably the best case scenario for really any of this. A little bit of eye candy on our way out the door, just appreciating the view of Earth falling way behind us before we light up those HG3s one more time, and then just try to dial in our approach and see if we can't get it as on the level as possible and at least all matched up. But what it comes down to is about 1.9 degrees of difference in inclination. So we'll just make sure we can check and top our thruster fuel, a little bit of resource management, always my favorite part of this game, before jumping out to Ostrich Station in our medium Venus orbit to radio in some money. Because, oh boy, do we absolutely need it. Yeah, we're down to $500,000. That was after selling back some rockets, a few other things, but basically anything we can do to radio in more money, better off we will be. So a quick check through 1 or 2 science experiments realizes that we had not actually gotten some things from Venus's highlands. So lucky us, we actually got fortunate enough to where we could radio a few things in and stash a few other experiments away to dump into the lab later on when the lab has room to deal with it. So that was good. It was a solid like 50 grand from the radio in from the lab itself, and then a couple smaller radio ins, and enough to kind of stock the lab up and you know, keep them busy, keep them working on stuff. Even though we will be coming up on their return window sometime in the next year or so, so we need to make sure they're getting as much work done out here as possible before we go ahead and cycle the crew. Although they are not shy for life support. They've got like 7 years left. So our next launch, and this one was kind of like, well, while we're here and we're waiting for the lander prototype to finish production, we're going to go ahead and launch another Charlie resupply pod. This is our life support containing supply pod. We don't, strictly speaking, need it. We actually already launched one of these earlier in the window, and I think there's a almost full one on station currently, which would make for a lot of excess supplies on station. The goal here is really like having the food and water and all that stuff would be nice, but having the little bit of extra fuel that it brings along is probably worth the journey all on its own, because, well, you know, having any bit of extra fuel would be really, really nice to have. So there was basically the totality of our launch to orbit, our core stage separation, and now plotting for Mars as we get ready to ignite the B upper stage. Now, thankfully, this one has a heat shield, so once it arrives at Mars, it's almost free to correct its orbit and to get it low enough to where we can go ahead and use what little fuel the life support pod does contain to perform rendezvous and docking. Hopefully it'll bring enough extra fuel around to at least fuel something worthwhile before disposing of itself in the Martian, well, dirt. I was going to say atmosphere, but it won't be going fast enough to burn up, so it will be destroyed on impact. We tend to do that with a lot of things around Mars. Might be enough junk debris down there to build something worthwhile. Anyway, the Trans-Mars injection burn taking somewhere in the nature of 8 minutes or so, taking a fairly significant chunk of that 10-minute runtime, but there finally we are burning clear of Earth's gravity well, and there is our intersect at Mars, so we will plot ourselves a little correction a few hours from now to dial in our approach. With every subsequent launch of this window, our inclination with Mars becomes a little bit more difficult to achieve that that really nice intercept angle. I think this one we're going to come in still pretty cleanly at less than 3 degrees rendezvous, but you know, that mission at least is looking good. And then finally, almost 19 days after our last launch, our Mars lander prototype will take to the skies. And silly me performed a big snafu and turned on the fuel pumps on the launch clamps before launch, while we were waiting basically for our inclination with the moon to resolve so that we could go ahead and get this thing underway. Now, this had the nice effect of keeping our liquid hydrogen tanks topped off, but also filling up all that fuel that we drained from the lander itself, or rather the ascent stage. Well, in the lander, there's lots of tanks that I pulled all the fuel out of but did not lock, and so when those pumps turned on, it filled those fuel tanks. If you'll notice, our delta V here is significantly lower than what it was in the VAB previously. This is a problem, kind of, in that we have grossly exceeded the 2-orbit capacity of this monstrous TN6, in that, well, we can still make it to orbit, absolutely, but the delta V readings on our B upper stage is something like 2,600 meters per second. That's not enough to make our transfer, which means we're going to have to use some fuel from the capture stage to finish our transfer to Mars. Here we are coming up on the end of core stage, and we actually have to light the B upper stage to finish getting to orbit. This is how grossly overweight we are. Trying to figure out as much of that as I can and cut off the engine as soon as possible, leaving our periapsis at 142 kilometers. This is also about to become a problem. You see our node here has us pointing way at the atmosphere and sinking that periapsis rather quickly. So in order to not go screaming, burning, and flailing through the atmosphere, we're going to have to angle ourselves above the node and just try to balance out that periapsis at something above 140 kilometers. Now that's something that we can compensate for a little later on by once we start ascending away from Earth's atmosphere. We're going to start angling below the node to try to like equalize it out. Here's that maneuver there. But the lack of efficiency of burning at an angle to the node instead of directly through the node costs us delta V. Quite a bit of it actually, where we're going to have about 1300 meters per second left to burn on this maneuver when the B upper stage is extinguished. Now, my attempt at trying to do something about this is take all the fuel tanks that should have remained empty and pump them into our transfer stage. We should be able to do this for almost all of the fuel without running into the runtime limitation on those experimental engines, although there's no solid way of telling. So when we get to Mars and we go to do our propulsive capture, it's going to be a pretty delicate balance of hoping that if one of those engines were to fail, hopefully it's just the center engine and we can just keep running the outside too until we've depleted their fuel, and then hopefully we'll still have enough fuel left in the lander itself to make rendezvous and docking at Harmonia Station without too many problems. Now, we did bring a spare engine. It doesn't necessarily mean I want to dispatch a crew to go install it. That's just more complexity than I really wanted to deal with. So our course is set. We are on the way to Mars. A little bit of last minute resource management, and that's going to do it for this one, everyone. Thank you so much for hanging out. I really do appreciate it, and I will see all of you in the next one. So until then, see you later.